Shalom. Today, the 23rd day of the first month of Adar of this year of redemption, 5784, corresponding to the 3rd of March of 2024. And I've chosen today to address a very universal topic, the topic of the Shabbat for all of the world, at a time when indeed it is perhaps strange for a Jew living in Israel to stand up and say, we have something to offer everybody, at a time when on the streets of many places over the earth there are marches fervently screaming and shouting in favor of something from the river to the sea, and in the process, I would say, really defying all of the norms of civilized behavior in indiscriminate attacks on anybody who is seen to be identified as a Jew or as an Israeli or as a supporter of Jews and of Israelis. And this is a most serious development which does not bode at all well for the people of the world who are, without further examination of the facts, jumping to judgments. They're being fed in many cases by insidious propaganda, by lies which can be easily disproven by evidence, and yet people are continuing to believe the most evil things about the state of Israel, the army of the state of Israel, the people of Israel, and the whole Jewish people, who are collectively being held responsible for the war that is taking place in Gaza, despite the fact that Gaza was handed from the jurisdiction of Israel under the Gush Katif expulsion arrangements of 2005 to the Palestinian Authority, and Gaza, which by then was an independent entity, subsequently elected the Hamas government, which subsequently invested literally billions of foreign aid in the construction of the most sophisticated subterranean and terror network with heavy arms and armaments, and have been attacking Israel for years and years with the barrages of rockets, and then followed the episode of the 7th of October. And what I want to most protest before I enter into the subject of the Holy Shabbat is particularly those in the academic communities in the Western countries, and indeed there are those in Israel too, who are doggedly following standpoints that can be refuted by facts, that are rooted in prejudice, and that are actually aimed at destroying the state of Israel, the state of Israel as a Jewish state associated with the Jewish people. And what we are seeing across campuses in America right now is indiscriminate attacks on any students who are walking across campus, walking to lectures, trying to enter meetings, indiscriminate attacks if they are seen to be identified as Jews or supporters of Israel. And this is completely contrary to all of the norms of academic freedom and the freedom of speech. It's one thing for the academic authorities to allow for the freedom of speech of those who choose to support the so-called Palestinian cause. It is another thing to allow those supporters of that cause to intimidate and cause fear and even panic among those who have another standpoint, another position. And the fact that the academic authorities and the administrations of many of the campuses that have seen the worst outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence against Jewish students have failed either to condemn or control this. And what I would like to say as I enter into the subject of the Shabbat is that God Almighty is God over everybody and everyone. Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, non-believer, agnostic, skeptic, everybody, scientist, astronomer, cosmologist, cosmogonist. God is king and ruler over all and knows better than everybody and knows better than every religion. And God is inside each and every one of us. Actually, the very fact that we have an ego, we have a one that thinks that I am me and I have my life, and the world began on the day I was born and will end to all intents and purposes in my present understanding the day I have to leave this place and be taken from here. But this I and this me is actually God's gift to me to make me think that I am an independent entity that is going to hopefully through my path through this world enjoy the radiance of his presence. But God is in the ego of everyone in the world, whether they know it or they don't know it, whether they think in terms of being a Buddhist, whether they think in terms of being a Muslim or a Christian or anything else. And God can play tricks with people because God has a code for everyone. And that code is the code of the 7 universal laws, known as the 7 laws of all of the children of Noah. We won't get tied up in what is defined as idolatry and what is not idolatry. Certainly any line of thought and behavior that is wantonly destructive is an abomination in the eyes of the creator of the world, who is all kindness and all abundance. And wanton violence and destruction is itself one of the worst forms of blasphemy there could be, not to speak of denial of any other faith other than a particular faith that the person wants to espouse. To wantonly despise the Holy Torah is itself blasphemy. But certainly the 7 laws of mankind prescribe murder and certainly violent assault and injuring others. They prescribe immorality. They prescribe robbery and theft, wanton cruelty to animals, and of course injustice, the 7th and probably one of the most abused of the 7 laws of Noah, the law that authorities in the countries and the states must establish courts of justice, which must be free of the corruption that runs rampant from the top to the bottom in practically all of the judicial systems and the political systems of the world. And the world indeed is very far from the 7 laws of the children of Noah, to judge by the fact that many people are parading in the streets their support for murderers and rapists and looters, robbers, millions and millions of people. And they should remember that when God judges people, God does not say to the person, look, we are judging you now. What do you think the verdict you should be in your case? Do you think you are righteous or not? Because almost everybody will say, well, of course they are righteous. So God shows the person a particular situation which carries different viewpoints and says, well, how do you judge this situation, which is actually set up to be a reflection of the person's behavior, and according to the way they judge it, so shall they be judged, as in the case of the prophet coming to King David after he had taken Bathsheba for his wife. And the prophet didn't say to him, David, you have taken a woman who has been married to another man. He said to him, I'd like to tell you a story about a poor man who had a tiny little lamb who was a member of his poor family and eating from the food from his hands. And there came to the house of a rich man, a wayfarer, a visitor, and the rich man didn't want to take from his own huge flock, so he comes and takes the little lamb of the poor man, and feeds the visitor, and David jumps to his feet and says, well, that person is liable to all of the penalties that he is liable to. And of course, David was judging himself. And here the world is being shown facts that can actually be verified by anybody who wants to take the trouble to look at more than one or two favorite news and propaganda and brainwashing media. It's quite possible to establish what the truth is today, but many people are hypnotized by the brainwashing, by the propaganda, by the slanted information. And what happens? These people are making really evil choices. And what is happening is that they're actually, through their choices, locking themselves out. They are locking themselves out through their prejudices, through their hatred, through the evil eyes with which they look at the Torah of Israel and the people of Israel. They are locking themselves out of the Enchanted Garden, the locked garden, the garden of the springs of purest water, of the flowers, the herbs, the fragrances, the beauty of the Torah, the depth, the infinite wisdom. They are locking themselves out through their prejudices, and they will never be able to get in until they break their stubborn hearts, or they will be swept away. And meanwhile, Israel laughs at the people who are screaming their protests, who never protested the other injustices across the world, who never protested the injustices perpetrated against the innocent citizens of Israel in all of the multiple terror attacks. And those people who are filled with hatred and venom are locking themselves out. And they are far from the holiness of the Shabbat of the people of Israel, which is not only for the people of Israel, as I shall elaborate, but for all of the nations of the world. The Holy Bible has been available for well over 22,000 years to people across the civilized world, and clearly states that on the seventh day God has decreed the Shabbat, and the practice has been incorporated in a certain form into Christianity on what is called the Lord's Day on Sunday. There is a day of particular devotion in the faith of Islam on Friday, and the concept of a seventh day set apart is known across the world. However, when a Jew gets up and says that the Shabbat, as commanded in Exodus and the Ten Commandments, and again in Deuteronomy in the second repetition of the Ten Commandments, when the Jew gets up and says, yes, but this Shabbat should be marked by all of the world, immediately the voices will be raised. But doesn't the Talmud state that idolater who observes the Shabbat is liable to the death penalty? It is forbidden for an idolater to observe the Shabbat. So what am I doing getting up and saying that people across the world should be marking the Shabbat? And I'm certainly not saying this out of my heart, out of some feat of imagination in my mind. In fact, the concluding verses of the prophet Isaiah look forward to the day when all flesh will come to Jerusalem for the Sabbaths and the new moons. It is quite clear that ultimately all humanity will mark and recognize the Shabbat. Now, is this to be now, or is this to be at some point in the future? I would venture to offer, at this time when many, many people across the world are filled with a sense of fear and foreboding about developments in the light of what has happened to the world over the last 5 years and more, with the epidemic and the financial ramifications, the social and the psychological, spiritual ramifications. Many, many people are in a state of profound shock and anticipation. We are seeing across the world, besides the wars between nations, not only in the Middle East, but also, of course, in further east in Iraq and Armenia, and of course between Russia and Ukraine, with NATO now entering into the picture, and with China menacing Taiwan, and with North Korea menacing South Korea, and many other trouble spots in the world. And in countries themselves, we are seeing marches and protests across Europe. Farmers are protesting against legislation which is crippling, they say, their farms. This is in across Europe, in Ireland, and in Britain, and many other phenomena across America. People are profoundly disquieted by the numbers of immigrants coming into the country who are not upholding the traditional values of the country. And many people across the world, there is evidence, are certainly turning to God. And this, of course, is surely by the designer of God, that all of these ramifications. Indeed, as a Jew living in Israel, I'm quite certain that the terror that we've endured from Gaza and from other centers of Arab population are all, however bitter they are, God's rod, and ask us to do our inner heart searching. But with that, as we do our inner heart searching, we turn to the people of the world with the Shabbat, because I believe the Shabbat is the ultimate healing, the ultimate remedy for the world. I was privileged to regularly attend the Devar Torah of the late Rabbi Yoel Schwartz, Tzaddik Livracha, who was the Av Bet Din, the deputy of the renewed Sanhedrin, which he was involved with from the start, and was second to the late Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, who was the second Nasi of the Sanhedrin after the late Rabbi Moshe Halberstam, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. And when Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz passed away, Rabbi Yoel Schwartz succeeded him as the head of the Sanhedrin until his own passing a couple of years back. And on Friday evenings, he would regularly speak at our synagogue in Jerusalem when I was living there. And many, many times he returned to this theme, that the Shabbat must be taught to and spread among the nations of the world. And he made a distinction between the observance of the Shabbat by the Torah observant Jewish people as against the recognition of the Shabbat that is asked of the nations. Most certainly, when the Talmud says that an idolater is forbidden to observe the Shabbat, what is being said is that it is forbidden for this idolater to take upon himself the entire apparatus of the observance of Shabbat as taught by Judaism and offer it to his God. And indeed, until he converts to the way of the Torah, he should not observe the Shabbat in the full way that observant Jews observe the Shabbat. But we have to qualify, when the Talmud states that an idolater must not observe the Shabbat, We must understand that this is a term used in the Talmud for people who literally were worshipping idols, as in the time of our sages, in the time of Greek and Roman polytheism, with statues of idols all over the place in city squares and bathhouses and all over. And there are very specific definitions of what is idolatry in the writings of our sages, in the tractate of Avodah Zarah and all of the laws surrounding idolatry. But today it is generally agreed that the world is largely advanced beyond idolatry. This cannot be said to be entirely true, unfortunately, because there are different kinds of idolatries. There's the idolatry of people's ego. There's the idolatry of wealth. There's people's idolatry, literally, of the Satan. It's very extensive today, although hidden from the public eye. There are other forms of idolatry that could be discerned. But for a person who is not specifically Jewish either by heredity, by birth, or by conversion, or by choice, as soon as the person has rejected idolatry and accepts the universal laws of the children of Noah, not only is that person permitted to mark the Shabbat, Rabbi Schwartz taught that they should do, with family meals and prayers and other activities fitting for the day, as I will elaborate presently. But were they to make a declaration of their allegiance to the 7 laws of the children of Noah before a competent Beis Din, a rabbinical court, they could at that time accept upon themselves to observe the Shabbat in the way that Orthodox observant Torah Jews observe the Shabbat, although this is not necessary. Rabbi Schwartz was not in favor of running out to try to convert the whole world to Orthodox Judaism. He was in favor of teaching the 7 Noahide laws to all humanity, and that the observance of the Shabbat, the recognition of Shabbat, even without the halachic stringencies of the Orthodox Torah Shabbat, but the recognition of the Shabbat is itself a recognition of the Creator. Because when the Torah says in the Hebrew verse that was read yesterday in the synagogue, V'shomru b'nei Yisrael es HaShabbat, the children of Israel observe the Shabbat, Ki sheishes yomim osa Hashem es hashomayim v'ha'oretz. For 6 days God created the heavens and the earth. This phrase is untranslatable into English without distorting the meaning. If you say it means in 6 days God created heaven and earth, this is extremely difficult for the contemporary mind to accept. And to claim that the entire world as we know it was produced, hey presto, in 6 24-hour days at the beginning of creation, literally 5,784 years ago. Anybody who wishes to believe this is welcome to believe this, and I do believe that God could have brought into existence just 5,784 years ago a world that looks just like ours. However, the concept of the 6 days of creation is a metaphysical concept, that there are 6 fundamental dimensions of creation, which are the 6 attributes of the Holy One. Blessed be He, kindness, strength, beauty, victory, splendor, and foundation. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, the 6 Sefirot of the building of creation reflected in the 6 days of creation and the account of creation in Genesis chapter 1. These are not just 6 24-hour days. These are expressions of attributes that develop are revealed through time, but not in the time as measured by our puny human minds that can only stay awake for not more than normally missing more than one night's sleep. The Shabbat is a recognition that beyond our human activities, we are completely dependent upon the kindness and the mercy of the one who sends the winds and the rains and has arranged the species of the crops that feed us and nourish us, the trees and their fruits, the animals, and has set up everything so wonderfully and left us in this world of abundance to see how we are going to do things, and are we going to follow his rules, his basic rules. Rabbi Schwartz would quote from a passage in one of the classical commentators on the Torah, commenting on the passage in Exodus, in the chapter of the giving of the Torah, the Ten Commandments, discussing the Fourth Commandment, remember the Sabbath day. As mentioned, there are two places in the Torah that the Ten Commandments are written, in Exodus chapter 20 and also in Deuteronomy. And in both of the versions, the mitzvah of Shabbat is the fourth commandment. However, there is a difference in the wording in Exodus from the wording in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, the verse begins, remember the Shabbat day. For in 6 days God created heaven and earth and rested on the seventh day. In Deuteronomy, the text reads, observe the Sabbath day, for you were a slave in Egypt. And in the name of this commentator, the Kli Yakar, one of the classic commentators on the text of the Torah, Rabbi Schwartz says that the version of the commandments in Deuteronomy does indeed specifically refer to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people, and to those who have converted to the way of the Torah, because it mentions the exodus from Egypt, which occurred to the people of Israel, and the Shabbat, indeed, one of its two fundamental messages is the freedom from servitude to flesh and blood. The Shabbat frees us through the freedom of the path of the Torah from being slaves to Pharaoh and slaves to flesh and blood. Even if we have to work like slaves during the week, if we observe the Shabbat, we have one day of complete freedom and transcendence from that. But this specifically refers to Israel. However, the version of the Ten Commandments in Exodus, which was said to and heard by all the world, says, remember the Sabbath day, be aware of the Sabbath day. Just because you are not commanded to abstain from all labors like Israel, and just because you are not commanded to have the whole order of prayers and other observances of the Shabbat day, that does not mean that you are not allowed to recognize a Creator, and that the Creator has ordained, in order to internalize the message of these 6 attributes of creation, and an attribute that is beyond them, where the kingship of God is revealed on the 7th day. This is available to everyone. Now, the observance of the Shabbat by Israel will not necessarily be the same as the observance of Israel by those who are not Jews by heredity, by birth, or by conversion, or by choice. Rabbi Schwartz has a book of prayers and customs and practices for those who have chosen to follow the Noahide path. He has presented some prayers for the Shabbat. He particularly emphasized the importance of family meals on the Shabbat, according to the custom of each family to invest the day with a special joy. Certainly appropriate depending upon the age of the members of the family or the group of friends and associates, to invest the meals with the teachings, readings from texts, with prayers and songs of joy. The Jewish people are not allowed on the Shabbat to play musical instruments. The only place where the Torah permits the Jew to play musical instruments on the Shabbat is in the Holy Temple by the Levites. However, there were cases through Jewish history where the most orthodox of rabbis permitted, in certain cases, Jewish people having available music played by non-Jewish musicians. For example, at a festive marriage banquet on a Shabbat, where it was permitted to have musicians in the background playing non-Jewish musicians, but the people who are marking the Shabbat, who are not converted or born Jewish people, have the option to accompany their singing with musical instruments. A most important point to emphasize is in the commandment of the Shabbat, the text tells us that the Shabbat is Shabbat leHashem, Shabbat to the Lord, Shabbat to the one God over all creation. And here is a point that the entire world needs to learn, with very few exceptions. Only those who are accustomed already to have a full day of devotion separated from their daily activities will understand this. But the Shabbat, you see, is not the weekend, it's not the day off or the end of the week. Yes, certainly it's a day off mundane work in the physical world. And this is and can be true in most places today for the non-Jewish person as for the Jew, where in most cases people are able, if they wish to mark the Shabbat, to have Shabbat as a day where they're not required to work, or in the case of non-Jews, to have a day with more limited working hours if possible. The separation from the mundane world, you see, is necessary because the Shabbat is not primarily for me, but for my devotion to the one God, which will actually bring me the greatest joy. We speak on the Shabbat of a concept that is called Oneg Shabbat, the delight of the Shabbat, the delight of the joy of the songs, of the supreme moments of the prayers, but also of the delights of the fragrances of the spices that we will inhale with the blessing, with the tempting foods that we will prepare during the week for the Shabbat meals. All these are parts of the delight of the Shabbat, because these physical delights will actually enhance our spiritual state, together with, for those to whom it's agreeable, good wine and spices and other things that enhance the spirit. And for that reason, the Hebrew word oneg consists of three words, three letters, which allude to three words which are the key to the flow of godly light and beauty from the highest levels. The top joy in all creation is Adin. The Garden of Adin is the place where the Adin, the ultimate bliss, is given to those to whom God grants this. And it's contained in the Gan, in the garden. And from the garden flows a river. So the delight of Adin is a word that begins with the Hebrew letter Ayin, Adin. The river that flows is the Nahar, and the garden is the Gan. And those three words have as their initial letters the letters Ayin, Nun Gimel Oneg. In other words, the Shabbat is a joy of the soul coming from the higher spiritual levels. And who will say that this is only available to a Jewish person who is observing all of the halachot? In the Holy Midrash, Tana Devei Eliyahu, the beginning of chapter 9, he says that any individual, Israelite or non-Israelite, a free man or a slave, a male or a female, anyone is able to attain Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, all according to their efforts. Now, I'm not talking in promoting the observance of Shabbat to anybody and everybody who just wants a kind of a little enhancement to their very egocentric weekend. I'm talking to people who really search to be close to the one God, to feel the one God is everywhere. And we want to break through the barriers that separate us from God, and no time is better than the Shabbat. A time to be with dear ones, with one's spouse, with children, with dear friends, community. It's very important to be inventive in finding activities on the Shabbat that will keep children happily occupied, with incentives. Very important, if you have children, to give them quality time on the Shabbat, to prepare stories and materials to tell them prior, think about it, and special treats and other incentives for a non-Jewish person who is not bound by the stringencies of the limitations of the halakha. There are many things that can be done on Shabbos that will enhance the children's awareness of the beauty of the creation. A visit to a zoo to see other forms of life, a visit out into the country to observe growth and nature where this is possible, and many other things. And even in the home, when it's not possible to get out, if parents are able to assemble materials that are going to bring our young generation into greater awareness of the wonder of this creation and the importance of protecting the creation and caring for the creation, and the importance of righteous ways as opposed to the wanton violence and cruelty that are rampant today. We have so much that we can attain on this special day. And if anybody is in doubt about all of this, I would like to read from the work of the commentary of the Kli Yakar, speaking about the Shabbat as it applies to all the world. On the contrary, he says, all the peoples of the world are obliged to remember and be aware of the Shabbat. It's in his commentary of the Kli Yakar of Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim ben Aaron Lundschitz, who was living in the second half of the 16th century and the early 17th century, discussing the commentary, the words of the commandment, the fourth commandment, remember the Shabbat. The Torah did not want to say guard the day of the Shabbat, as in the second version in Deuteronomy, in order not to allow the nations to say, well, how can he be commanding us to guard against performing any forbidden labor, because the children of Noah have already been told that day and night they shall not rest. The nations were told not to rest on the Shabbat. And from here the sages learned in the Talmud that a member of the nations who rested on the Shabbat is liable to the death penalty. For that reason it says here, remember the day of Shabbat. Remember, that is to say, even if one who is not bound to guard the Shabbat by abstaining from labor is still included in the commandment of remembering the Shabbat, being aware For all the nations are obliged to remember the day of Shabbat in order to fix in their hearts the faith and belief in the renewal of creation, which is God's faithful testimony to his existence. For included in the 7 commandments of the children of Noah is the prohibition against idolatry. And even though the nations are unable to embrace the negative commandment against performing all labor on the Shabbat, they can nevertheless take upon themselves the commandment of remembering the Shabbat, to which they are obliged, in order that the renewal of the universe may be before their eyes for memorial. In other words, this will lead to greater respect for this wonderful creation instead of the wanton destruction. However, in the second version of the 10 Commandments, which was given only to Israel, the fourth commandment uses the expression to guard the Shabbat. For Israel are obliged to remember the Shabbat and also to guard against the performance of any forbidden labor. That's Israel. And that's why in the second version of the 10 Commandments, the reason given for the 10 Commandments, for the observance of Shabbat, is that you may remember that you were a slave. For this is the reason for abstaining from forbidden labor on Shabbat. Well, Rabbi Schwartz did repeatedly emphasize the importance of Shabbat observance. And at this time when so much of the world is railing against Israel, and I say again, look, the Shabbat is a sacred and closed garden. You reject Israel, you reject the Torah, you're going to keep yourself outside. That's your choice, that's your business. But we are offering you not our gift, but God's gift to creation, a day when everybody is able to just acknowledge that there's one creator of everything and to give thanks. There's so much for each and every person to give thanks. And so many people are blaming everybody else, complaining about what they don't have and why don't they have this. There are people who are demanding that whoever does have anything should give it over to those who have less. There are those who consider it their right and their privilege to go in and wantonly loot stores and homes, robbery. This is happening in the so-called advanced countries, and it's being, not to speak of other countries. And the world has gone crazy. We are finding that in many countries the judiciary are treating cases of robbery and rape and other crimes lightly. They're saying, well, the poor perpetrator comes from a culture where their standards are different, where they don't have the standards of Western culture, so we have to deal with them lightly. To the point where there are places in New York where the staff of stores have been told not to go after shoplifters where the sum is less than $1,000. It's a complete craziness. It's a complete flies in the face of the Noahide laws that the judiciary should do this. And I'm not wanting to get into controversy here about the behavior of certain judges in certain areas, which is obviously completely biased through prejudice and political bias. Examples of the injustices in the so-called justice system across the world, the favoritism of whoever finds favor in the eyes of the elites at the time, who they want to deal with lightly, and those that they decide to deal with severely. You and I are not going to be able to do very much about this on the macrocosmic level, but certainly we can free ourselves of all this pain and grief on our day of rest and turn off our devices, turn off our televisions and our radios and our computers and other devices, our phones, and just free ourselves from that crazy world out there. And we discover, after a little discomfort maybe at the quiet suddenly, we discover that the world carries on very well without all of our devices, and has been doing so for many, many thousands of years, and will continue doing so. And we can actually just relax. Rabbi Schwartz, of blessed memory, was in favor of all people benefiting from the rich treasury of prayers contained in the Siddur, the traditional Jewish prayer book, the prayers for weekdays and for the Shabbat, and also the prayers in King David's Psalms and other devotions. He was certainly in favor of non-Jewish people reserving the Shabbat particularly for spiritual pursuits, for meditation, prayer, and studies in the search for connection with God. Quality time, again, quality time with dear ones. And this message is really the message of peace at a time when the whole world is crying, war, war, war. As King David says in Psalm 120, Ani shalom, I am peace. Vehemo lemilchomo, it is they who are for the war. Not me, not the Holy Shabbat. The Shabbat sits above the world beyond. She will open her light to anybody who is willing to open themselves to it. I'm speaking now to serious spiritual seekers. Do you know, if you will, as the sun begins to set on Friday afternoon, enter into a state of mind where you say to yourself, now is the Shabbat of the one God, Hashem Adonai, Lord God of Israel, the God of all the universe. And on the Shabbat, our speech should be different. We abstain from talking about business, politics, gossip. And the speech of the Shabbat is purified with thanksgiving, the blessings, the prayers, the songs, silence. And when you will open yourself to God, He will open His light to you in a way that you will never believe. Already across the world, our Jewish brothers and sisters, many so shocked and stunned by the events of Shmini Atzeret, the 7th of October, are strengthening themselves in our faith and our tradition. Girls and women are lighting Shabbos candles. Men on weekdays are donning the tefillin, praying and observing the Shabbat. And all those who walk with Israel, there is an open invitation from the sages of Israel to recognize the Shabbat and thereby to recognize that there is one Creator. And through this recognition, the world will ultimately attain the peace until all flesh will come to observe the Sabbaths and the new moons in God's holy temple in Jerusalem.